Hello, and welcome to our latest conversation in our Let's Talk Immigration series. Thanks to my conversation partner today, Mark Prosser. Mark is the Director of Pastoral Planning at the Diocese of Sioux City in Iowa. Mark is also a board member with the National Immigration Forum, and maybe most famously, Mark is the recently retired Director of Public Safety in Storm Lake, Iowa. Mark, it's my honor to talk with you today. You have been a huge supporter of the Bibles, Badges, and Business work, and I thought, who better to interview than a person who represents two of our Bs, both Bibles and Badges. So thanks for taking the time to join us today.
Good morning. I am happy to be with you.
Excellent. So let's jump right in. I want to start kind of with the Badges aspect of your career. You had a long career serving in law enforcement. So tell us about how you came to be a police officer and how you grew to see serving immigrants as an integral part of community safety.
You bet. I'm not sure how I ended up in law enforcement. I'm the youngest of five, and everyone else in my family up through my grandparents is in medicine. And so, but at a young age, I wanted to go into law enforcement. I didn't have an aha moment. I didn't know any law enforcement officers, but it's just something I was always drawn to. And so got involved early in my life in some scouting, explorer post, police cadet programs that are sponsored by law enforcement agencies, and just got bit by the bug. And so went and got related college degrees and so on. So I grew up, my home was East St. Louis, Illinois. Grew up in the metro St. Louis area. And after college, worked for a suburb of St. Louis on the Illinois side of the river, O'Fallon, Illinois, where I served in the patrol division, investigations, and then was the detective division supervisor, and then also deployed to the St. Louis Major Case Squad, which is a regional homicide task force. And did that and got in really interested in administration as I moved into supervisory positions. At a pretty young age, I started getting interested in that. And so I started testing and was offered a position as the police chief in Storm Lake, Iowa, which it's a community of about 14 or so thousand people, but substantially smaller than the metro area I came from. And so I accepted that, truthfully, with a personal goal of being there for a few years, getting my teeth cut, and then moving on, possibly back to my home area or to some other area. But fell in love with the city, recognized that it was changing quickly and becoming more diverse, and really a center for diversity and an ethnic center. And so ended up staying there over 30 years as their police chief and public safety director, and then ended a 40-plus year career retiring from there. When I started as their chief, I would have never predicted that, but it didn't take long to feel like home for me.
That's great. Yeah, so you mentioned Storm Lake, and the forum has done a lot of reporting and been part of a lot of conversations in Storm Lake. It really is, in some ways, from our perspective, a model of how small town America can celebrate diversity, can really set a welcoming agenda for people from all around the world. Share some of the secrets of Storm Lake's success that might be replicated elsewhere.
I think it's Storm Lake's diversity and how the city adapted to those shifts in demographics in a pretty narrow span of time historically that kept me there and really kept me interested in there and really seeing the community change. Storm Lake became the poster child of diversity for the state of Iowa, which is not a very diverse state, but it's a community that has very large packing plants there and didn't have a large employment base, and subsequently the major employers, the packing plants, would recruit from different parts of the country a very diverse workforce to help grow those plants that have well over 3,000 combined packing plant jobs now in a community of about 14,000 people. And so what the city saw was a pretty rapid change in its demographics, kind of in waves of Southeast Asians, Spanish-speaking community members, and then refugees from Africa, Hmong, Hmong, just a whole wide variety of folks, the Sudan, Somalia, Ethiopia, Burmese, that continue to call Storm Lake home and just came in waves. And so, you know, the city could have gone two different directions. It could have thrown up its hands and said, we don't want this, or they could have recognized the value and the beauty of this shift in demographics. And I think what else was going on at the same time, and this kind of happened late 80s, but really exploded in the early 90s and continues to change today. What really happened on the part of leadership, mayors, county board of supervisors, hospital administrators, on my behalf as the chief, school superintendents, and so on, that they really saw that in rural America, and most certainly in rural Iowa, many of the communities that were unattached to urban areas were dying. We're consolidating school districts. We're having their major employers shift to larger urban areas because they didn't have an employment base and they wanted to look for other opportunities. And I think folks, A, recognize that we're all much more alike than we are different. That B, the real difference, the real challenge in the shift of demographics was primarily language, the ability to communicate. And so how do we overcome that? And C, what a wonderful way to grow our community and to remain strong as we saw other communities of equal size shrinking and consolidating. That was never an issue and continues to not be an issue in Storm Lake. It's growing unattached to any urban center. Their challenges in that community are school overcrowding and building new schools, not consolidating and closing school buildings. Their problem there is not open housing, it's a housing shortage because of the need for housing at every socioeconomic level. And so I think it was a perfect storm that came together, that you had folks that understood that, folks that appreciated the change, and then tried to nurture it as best we could.
It's a beautiful story. So talk more about how the civil society, the law enforcement that you were involved in, but also schools and just the structure of the community adjusted to having all of these different ethnic groups represented with all their different languages. What were some of the challenges and how did you guys overcome those?
The number one challenge, bar none, was language. How do we communicate and how do we provide services to folks we can't communicate with? And that was across several different spectrums. In 1991, the City Council of Storm Lake and the County Board of Supervisors in the county there, Buena Vista County, they put together a task force called the Task Force on Unmet Needs. And they did a one-year study in education, social services, health, and public safety on what the impact was of the shift in demographics. What did we need to do? How did we need to better serve? What should we prepare for? And in 1991, Storm Lake looked a lot different than it does in 2020. So, I mean, the percentages were much smaller in the change than what they are today. But it all came back to one thing. We studied, we looked, how do we communicate? How do we provide services? How do we find out and learn what folks' needs are and what help they're asking for? And then in turn, how do we communicate local laws, local policies, how to get housing, how to access education and health, and so on. It all came back to language. And so you started to see from that point forward the shift and the importance of the shift of a multilingual workforce, getting folks who could speak in different languages into our businesses, into our courthouse, into our emergency room, into our police cars, and things like that. And once we learned how to work in a multilingual environment, then with 2 or 3 languages, now with 30 plus, then the stress came down a little bit. And granted, in Northwest Iowa, unattached to any urban center, sometimes finding interpreters and translators was a challenge, especially with so many different languages and vernaculars of languages spoken. But we did it. And sometimes we made mistakes, and sometimes we had great successes, but we always tried to learn from those successes. And I just want to tell you that it has changed so much that last academic year, our public school system, pre-K through 12, citywide, just about 85% non-Caucasian with about 28 languages spoken in the classroom. Our parochial system, about 66% non-Caucasian. So it's who we are now. But it was a learning experience. And we learned, we tried to do things what I always called the white way. Let's have a meeting. Let's invite folks to a city council meeting. Well, our new community members didn't do business. Let's have a potluck. Well, those didn't really work well early on, and I'll tell you why in a second. Let's form a diversity committee. And so we formed diversity committees and diversity task forces that were all white. But it was done well intended. We were very early in this change, and the people at that table really wanted to help and really wanted to facilitate change and become a more welcoming community. And so we learned over the years, and for those of us who were getting older, over the generations, how to do that better and actually bring those impacted to the table to help be decision makers and things like that. And I'll just give you a couple of examples of lessons learned. The potlucks, early on, early 90s, because we're in rural Iowa, we're out there. Well, we do potlucks for our churches, we do them for our civic groups. Let's have a potluck, and every one of you people on the diversity committee, you find a person of color or a new arrival in our community, and you bring them. And so we did. And it was well intended, so we could meet, learn, and know. And but then when we started doing them once a month, many of our diverse community members didn't come back. And then we learned culturally, especially with first generation folks, that you don't, in many countries, you don't host a party and then ask the guests to bring the meat. And now it's not so much. Generationally, everybody gets involved with potlucks, but early on, you had to understand your audience. Our city council, thinking forward, said, you know what? We really want to hear from our Hispanic community in this one example, but they won't come to city council meetings, and so let's go to them. And so they learned of kind of a large festival gathering for our Hispanic populations. Let's take our city council, our department heads, and ask permission to come there to hear people. How can we better help, and so on. Nobody showed up. Well, why? It was Sunday, and it was also championship soccer in the adult league, the championship game. If we'd have known a little bit more, we should have been at the soccer field, at the stadium where the championship game. So it was these little things that we gradually learned to do better. And what I learned as a police administrator is that, especially with folks with so many different backgrounds and coming from so many different parts of the world, it was quite clear that their experience with government, most importantly, their experience with law enforcement, was just a lot different. They came from areas where the police sometimes were the police, they were the judge, they were the jury, and they were the executioner. They came from abusive backgrounds, heavy-handed backgrounds, sometimes from our own nation. Sometimes that was their experience in different larger urban areas, but a lot of times from their native land. And so what I learned is we had to do things different. We had to go above and beyond in creating relationships. And it wasn't going to happen at large meetings. It wasn't going to happen because spokespeople for a particular ethnic group were going to come to the police chief's office and tell him what's wrong or what their concerns are. We had to take our game to them. And so we learned over the years to develop outreach programs, to move away from large meetings, but to small focus groups, to create neighborhood outreach programs where we went into the neighborhoods and continued to, not so much with COVID now, but pre-COVID, and on a weekly basis. And we were there with our service provider partners and the mayor and the fire department. We weren't there because of an emergency or a crime or a call for service. We were there to spend time to create relationships, build bridges, and meet people so they knew what law enforcement was about in Storm Lake, Iowa. So that was a long answer, but it was an evolution and a learning experience, and it really came down to constantly making relationships and creating relationships, and it can never end. It is a perpetual effort.
Yeah, thanks for that. So you mentioned COVID, and I'm curious, in small town Iowa, you kind of got out of the law enforcement game right before all of this hit. And so your predecessor, Chief Cole, I'm sure you have a lot of conversations with him. What are some of the challenges that COVID is presenting law enforcement in this relational aspect? How are they doing that now?
Well, and Chief Cole's a very gifted person, so the city's in good hands with him and his staff. But it's a challenge because the hot spots in early COVID were packing plants, and Storm Lake had two of them. So their numbers, because we were in rural America, the testing was slow getting there. But once testing started to get there, then the county that Storm Lake lies in, all of a sudden, percentage per population was number one on the New York Times list that they put out of COVID hotspots, just percentage per population. And so I know the chief, the city, their medical providers, their public health have worked tirelessly across ethnic lines trying to get the word out on testing, appropriate response protocols, public health protocols, and so on. And again, sometimes that's challenged by language. Sometimes that's challenged by cultural differences. It's often challenged, I have found, because I continue to work with advocacy groups there and across the state, specific to COVID also, that it's challenged by economic means. I may not feel good, but I still have to go to work because I have to put food on the table, and I can't afford to be furloughed, or I can't afford to go on sick time by the nature that I just have to have a paycheck to feed my family. That is a never-ending challenge, whether it's COVID or other types of things that impact the economy. But it's a constant work in progress for them there. So
you mentioned the packing plants, which is obviously an essential part of the economy in your part of the state. One of the things that we've been really trying to press into is how this pandemic is affecting all of us. The forum has been part of a coalition called the All of Us Coalition, and you've been a big supporter of that. And part of the message that we're trying to help people understand is how immigrants are essential workers during the pandemic. Can you talk about some other sectors of the economy there in Northwest Iowa where the immigrant population has been crucial to the response and recovery?
Well, Iowa's all about ag, and ag is all about food. Our governor, and we were not a state that closed up completely, but our governor determined, as they worked on statewide protocols, that 85% of our employees in the entire state were considered essential workers because we're all about food. And so it's been a drumbeat of mine, and hopefully it will continue for others, that within that conversation of COVID, we have really seen the struggle and the importance of our immigrant brothers and sisters as it applies to the food chain, at all aspects of the food chain. And Iowa, compared to other states, isn't nearly as diverse, nor does it have a large immigrant population, but it's the fastest growing population in Iowa. In communities like Storm Lake, and we have many of them in Iowa that have large packing plants, the bulk of their employees are immigrant. And those packing plants were pretty much told, keep going, keep going, keep going. We can't interrupt the food chain. We saw the stress of toilet paper on the shelves at our grocery stores. What if all of a sudden there's no food there? And these folks became very essential, and they I think, recognized and took to heart the importance of what they were doing. And so I think the challenge we have as we hopefully get on the backside someday of COVID and get back to some state of normalcy is to remember that whether they were DACA, whether they were new citizens, whether they were under some visa program, or whether they were undocumented, they were essential employees at a critical time in our country. And if they're essential then they're going to be essential tomorrow. And our country needs to understand that and respect that. And so that's why I try to bring that voice at an administrative level or at a state level or beyond, to beat that drum, because sometimes that was out of sight, out of mind pre-COVID. It was very much in sight and in view now that we're in COVID.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the other big challenges that our country is facing right now is around the conversation around police reform and systemic racism and racial injustice. How is that conversation playing out in your rural community? And as a former law enforcement professional, how do you view the calls for police reform?
You know, it's to be quite honest, it brings a lot of mixed emotions, because police reform means different things to different people. I am a strong believer that every organization and every discipline should always be in a constant state of process improvement. I think we're all like that. I don't care what we do. And law enforcement, most certainly, I think we need to learn from mistakes, and we need to always improve how we serve people, how we communicate with people, how we interact with people. There's a lot of customer service to law enforcement, and I think sometimes the profession forgets that, and I think sometimes the public forgets that they're just called on to do a lot of different things that aren't necessarily traditional police actions. And so in our community in Storm Lake, you know, I saw our uniformed officers and our police chief, and I was there at Black Lives Matter rallies on a knee, understanding the plight of our people of color and that there's clearly disparities there. And I think sometimes when we have incidents like what happened in Minneapolis, and I was early, I tweet quite a bit. I was early to tweet that out. It was just a crime. There's no debate there. It was criminal activity on the part of the police. But you know, that we need to learn from that. We need to acknowledge it, and we need to punish it. On the flip side, as a police administrator and a lifelong cop, I'm also aware that there's about 1.3 million law enforcement related contacts a day. And percentage of effectiveness versus other disciplines, our cops do a pretty good job. And so I think sometimes that gets lost in the midst of this, not by all, but by some, certainly in some of the public conversations. And so how do we balance that? And how do we say, yep, we make mistakes. Unfortunately, when we make mistakes, people get hurt or people die, versus the greatest majority are out there doing top-notch work, trying to build bridges and trying to create relationships. And so it is a very complex issue that needs continued work every day. It's not going to be solved because of a riot. It's going to be solved because leaders come to the table and admit the positive sides and the negative sides of what they're discussing and try to collaborate and move forward. It's going to be solved as the profession of law enforcement as they move forward, and hiring is very difficult and has been for years. A lot of people aren't going into that we are hiring the right people, that we are hiring communicators and learners versus enforcers and tough people. And I think the profession as a whole has recognized that for many years, but we have to continue down that road. We have to be able to have public conversations and debate and discourse in a civil manner. And law enforcement administrators need to be humble and recognize, you know what, we can do better here. On the flip side, those who are upset, mad, or opposed to law enforcement really need to understand that this conversation of defunding and just shutting down law enforcement is absolutely ridiculous, and it won't work. Today, yesterday, in the heat of the debates and the outcry and the rightful outcry of police excessive use of force, there's been no reduction in 911 calls in our nation. People of all colors, all socioeconomic backgrounds are still calling the cops because they need them. And the police are going, and that's not going to change. How we do business, of course, I'm retired, I shouldn't say we anymore, but how the profession does business, other types of programs, redirecting some funds so that the police don't have to go to mental health calls, don't have to go to certain non-emergency calls, and perhaps other types of entities can. I think those are viable conversations, and I think it can be blended with good police response. Or maybe the police can have new divisions designed in that fashion. But the defunding from one end and that sort of thing, it's not going to work. On the flip side, police not changing and understanding the stress and the generations of folks not getting a fair shake, people of color, that needs to be understood at the other end of that spectrum. So we could talk hours about this, Adam, and it's not a one set of answers or dynamics that's going to fix it. So right now, my advice to younger law enforcement administrators, before we start throwing statistics about the effectiveness of police and perhaps some of the alleged police abuse numbers are not accurate, is to be quiet and listen and learn. And then when calmer heads come to the table, then talk about the realities of both worlds.
Yeah, that's great. You mentioned, you know, trying to find kind of middle ground approaches to things. And I think when we talk about immigration enforcement, you know, I'm reminded of the defund police conversation, kind of, it's mostly the same people who are saying not one more deportation. We should never deport people. And of course, that's not the stance of the National Immigration Forum, nor the Law Enforcement Immigration Task Force, the LEITF, which I want to turn to, that you've been a member of for a number of years, both as active law enforcement and now as retired. So can you talk about how your participation in that national task force of over 100 chiefs and sheriffs who want to find common sense solutions on immigration, how that positively affected your work in the community?
It really did. I was very proud, continue to be proud to be part of that task force. What I liked about it most is it brought like-minded law enforcement administrators together, not for the purpose of political posturing, but for the purpose of understanding that these are the populations we serve, whatever that might be. And these folks live in our communities, and we have to provide services. We just don't flip a switch because we don't like you or we don't agree with you and say we're not going to provide services. And so it was a wonderful resource. And I assure you that Storm Lake, Iowa was probably the smallest department, if not close, it had to be, of these large urban metro areas, but really found that our problems were very similar, percentage per population, and our challenges were the same. How do we provide appropriate service? And what are the realities specifically of the undocumented in our communities? In Storm Lake, and I submit in all communities, they are a very positive, viable portion of our communities. Understanding that I don't care who we talk about, there's always a small percentage that are problem children. There's a criminal element. But as a whole, like every other group, the greatest majority are good people trying to do what's right for their family, trying to save their family, trying to do what's right for themselves and make a living. And so for me, what I learned through the task force time and time again is, you know, as a police chief or a sheriff, this number, the amount of folks in dealing with the undocumented is so large in our country that it's gone beyond, it doesn't matter how they got here or why, and most of them were for very positive reasons, but it's the reality of still providing services to them in our communities and our jurisdictions, understanding they are a viable part of our jurisdiction, and also just from a pure business standpoint, understanding the reality that we're not going to deport them. I mean, it doesn't matter what your political party is. Our nation will not deport millions of people, whether you want to or not. We don't have the money, the infrastructure, the staff, the wherewithal to do it, or the gut to do it. And most people don't want it done. So let's move away from that political rhetoric and move to the business of how do we create a process? How do we reform immigration smart? How do we recognize right now low-hanging fruit like DACA, that is a no-brainer? Let's fix that, let's make it permanent, and move on to the next step incrementally in working in concert with each other, knowing that the debate And the discord over the undocumented has been around for decades. And unless we fix it, it's going to be around for decades. And the fix is, let's get these folks an appropriate path to be here legally, come out of the shadows, and be even more a viable part of our communities than they are now, because you remove that fear from their shoulders. And when I talk to groups, and I talked to a lot of groups, or did talk to a lot of groups, who just clearly did not agree with the political position of reforming immigration. And you know, there were individuals who clearly wanted everyone deported. But when you put it from a business standpoint and a reality standpoint, and they start thinking about it, they go, well, you might be right. You know, how do we do that? Well, we do it by fixing it, not deporting the folks. And so having the ability to hear that like-minded philosophy in many ways through the task force, and jointly being able to lend our voice to reasonable immigration reform, to the understanding that there's some bad actors and we have to incarcerate and prosecute bad actors, to understand that those many millions of undocumented folks who are in our cities and in our counties, they're good people and they're viable parts of our community, so we need to bring them out of the shadows. And to understand that border security is certainly necessary, but it's got to be smart border security. Look at the problem areas. Fences and walls don't work. Technology and staffing do, and smart supervision, that's the important way. And so that's always, the task force is a good resource, and they speak because they live it and serve folks every day. For a lot of our people in our country, for a lot of people in the state of Iowa that's not very diverse, it's a challenge for them to understand that, because diversity is out of sight, out of mind.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So shifting gears a little bit, you have moved from, at least professionally, from the badges space into the Bibles space, now working with the Diocese of Sioux City there in Northwest Iowa. Talk a little bit about how your Catholic faith impacts your views on immigrants and immigration.
You know, my faith, I was raised in a Catholic family. My mom and dad were Catholic missionaries in Guatemala for over 30 years, moving back and forth, or going back and forth, serving down there annually. I have a wife who has served the Catholic Church in development for 25 plus years, and who is now the director of the communications office for the Catholic Diocese of Sioux City, for their newspaper and social media. So I just had great examples in my life. And so back in the late 90s, having been involved in the music ministry in the Catholic Church and things like that, I wanted to do more. Went into a formation program and actually became an ordained deacon in 2007. So I've served in the ministry portion of the church since that time, in my off time in my home parish. And so one of the goals in the back of my head as I approach retirement is I'd really like to continue to serve the church. So having the opportunity of this position, serving the bishop after retirement, was an absolute blessing. And so now under pastoral planning, there's three major prongs to my work. Pastoral planning is easiestly put that I'm dealing with the reorganization of parishes and parish groupings due to a shortage of clergy, a pre-shortage. So we are reinventing the diocese, a very emotional type of work, as parishes may have to close or change their identity and so on. So that's one form or one portion of my job. Another one is special projects for the bishop. So unbeknownst to me, I'm overseeing and facilitating the COVID response task force and the closing of all the churches in 24 counties and reopening those, the impact on our Catholic schools and so on, for about 100,000 people. And then the third was I'm being allowed to continue to bring voice to immigration reform and kind of being a liaison with the other Catholic dioceses on all issues that have to do with diversity, immigration, and so on. Because really the fastest growing Catholic population in our diocese are Hispanic. So it's very much on our radar screen that we need to provide those types of services. And so my Catholic upbringing and now my Catholic service has really helped develop me on sitting in church as a kid and as an adult and hearing that message of service, hearing that message of outreach of, you know, just just what are we expected to do to be as people of Christ for our neighbor, for those in need. And I don't think it happened to me consciously, but as a law enforcement administrator, it certainly impacted me that, we have to do better and we have to do good in ensuring that we in policing and public safety in Storm Lake, Iowa, that we are adapting to our changing community and that we are providing services on an equal basis to everyone and doing our part to reach out to them and say, we are here for you. And I believe in my heart that law enforcement philosophy that continues today under Chief Cole, for me, came from the homilies I heard and the examples I saw in my Catholic faith.
Yeah, that's great. And it's interesting talking with people across the country who haven't quite explored yet all of the different commands of God in the Bible to love neighbor, to love stranger, Old and New Testament. And then kind of when people start to dig into that, it's kind of shocking, I think, to a lot of people, because it's just something that I think for a lot of, I'll speak for white evangelicals and perhaps white Catholics as well, it's something that perhaps we haven't dug into as much as we should have in our upbringing. But it's encouraging that, folks in the Catholic Church and the evangelical church, people of faith across the country and around the world are starting to have their eyes open to, what the scriptures really say about how we should treat each other.
It very much is. I just sent out a series of emails this morning to some other folks in the administrative offices here that have to do with Catholic education, the training of priests and so on, that said we really need to come together to make sure we're getting adequate training for our clergy and for our adult catechesis in racism and white privilege. And what does that mean in the Catholic Church, and what are we supposed to be doing? And the other thing is, there's no secret that the Catholics are very much anti-abortion and very strong in that, and the right to life. And my position there is to always remind folks that, for me, right to life is also equally important to a young child sitting in a cage at the border.
Exactly. And just trying to help people understand a holistic pro-life approach. Every life is created in God's image. Everybody is important. I think that's such an important dynamic for people to understand. So, Mark, we were really happy and just proud to have you join the board of the National Immigration Forum in the last year. Talk about why you decided to join us in that capacity and how you hope that can continue to allow you to be engaged.
Well, I have networked and worked with and for the forum and with Bibles, Badges, and Business for many years now. And I only get involved in board service on things and entities that I believe in. And I certainly believe in the mission of the Immigration Forum. I like how they do business because it's fact-driven and data-driven. And they try to talk to folks that may not necessarily agree. It's easy to preach to the choir. It's not always easy to preach to folks who may not like your music. But the forum does it, and they do it well. And I like that aspect. And it's everything's political these days, but I like that it's not done in a extreme partisan political way. It's, again, done with good information and the sharing of perspectives, and most certainly the sharing of real life experience. And so every board I have ever served on, it has a lot to do that I believe in their mission and what services they're providing. And I certainly believe that with the National Immigration Forum and your staff and Ali and everybody. I just like how they do business. And I've seen how they've done business because long before I knew much about the National Immigration Forum, they came snooping around Storm Lake, wanting to see what we do and how we do. And we shared our story, and I've learned other best practices through the forum to take back to that community. So I was quite honored to be asked, and hope that I can be a positive part of the future of the forum.
Thanks so much, Mark. And yeah, like I said, we're honored to have you. And so grateful for your work with the BBB, and all you're doing in Northwest Iowa. For those watching this video, we wanted to let people know that you can join Mark as part of our BBB network. We've actually just reframed our statement of principles around immigration reform. So if you want to check those out, you can go to bbb'immigration.org. You can add your name as an endorser of our principles for balanced, fair, compassionate immigration reform. And just really appreciate all of you across the country who are leading in so many incredible ways on this issue. So Mark, again, on behalf of the forum, thank you for all that you do in Iowa. Thanks for what you do for the forum. I'm Adam Mestel, and really glad to be here with you guys today. And thanks, Mark, and we'll talk again soon.
All right, thank you. God bless.